Why do birds sing? Well, maybe the question should be how do birds sing? Because on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to talk about birdsong, and we're going to talk about the difference between the way that birds make different sounds and the way that humans make different sounds. And we are going to listen to a clip of what I think is the most musical bird song I've ever heard. Plus, we'll ask the cards to give us a few bars of their most musical advice. I'm John Paulus, and you're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. If you've already subscribed, thank you so much. If you have a Brave browser, you can contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening. So the way human beings make words and song and sound is a lot different from the way that birds make their song and sound, and languages too. Scientists have studied many bird songs and found that even birds that are close in range to each other of the same species have different, dialects. And that's really interesting. And birds use song to, I guess this is part of the why do birds sing? Birds sing for a lot of reasons. But I think the idea of communication is the central one, the same reason that human beings speak, to communicate. And it's just that, birds have various reasons for communicating, whether it's signaling danger, whether it's calling a mate or looking for a mate, or if it's to scare other birds away or to bully them to get out of the way, or to trick other birds into thinking that there are lots of different birds present. That's a thing that the mockingbird does. The mockingbird imitates a whole different bunch of birds, 10 or 12 maybe, in any of its songs. And if you hear the songs of 10 or 12 birds in quick succession, and then all of a sudden it seems like they are repeating themselves in some way, then you very well may have a mockingbird around you. Some people think it sounds like the old, car alarm, but if you really want an imitative bird in terms of sounds from the environment that may be produced by humans or electronics, check out, I'll put this in the description. There's a video of a lyrebird in one of, I think, David Attenborough's shows. A lyrebird, not like, I'm not telling the truth, bird, but like the ancient instrument, the lyre. It's a Lyre. This describes various types of ancient stringed instruments, that eventually developed into things like the guitar and that kind of thing. But or it's a harp-looking thing, maybe. You've seen it before. The lyrebird in that video imitates a camera shutter and also imitates a forestry crew starting up their chainsaws and doing their work. It's incredible. So birds are extremely capable of producing all different types of sounds. Maybe the best imitative birds you are thinking of are birds like parrots that can reproduce the human voice when there are no other primates that can reproduce the voice, and there's no other animal that so accurately reproduces human speech. And the reason that scientists believe that parrots do that is because they're social animals in a very crowded forest situation. And so in that situation, they tend to communicate among one another, but also among any other species around. And so they're a very social bird, and they use it for communicating information about what's going on. So That's kind of interesting because that is, another form of communication that doesn't get talked about a lot with birdsong, but it is definitely an important element. We know so little in the grand scheme of things about what the words, the lyrics of bird songs are saying beyond, maybe a warning or a mating call or things like that, but like what the actual, so to speak, syllables of it, that do they form meaningful words? And that's an interesting thing to think about. The parrot, of course, can imitate human words, and the way that it does that is different from the way humans make up sound. Humans have things like lips and tongues that enable them to modify and articulate the sound, the voice, the just the plain old noise, the humming noise that's coming from your voice box, to make recognizably different and sharply distinct sounds and then syllables and words, and then communicate in a clear way with others. The parrot doesn't have any of those things. The way the parrot makes its sounds and the way that all birds make their sounds is through a completely different instrument, so to speak, called the syrinx. Now that I've said the word syrinx, I'm going to let you know that every word that I'm going to talk about in relation to the production of the sound of the voice in both birds and in humans come comes from the often they call it pre-Greek languages of the Greek-speaking areas of the Mediterranean, and but what they are basically are, but we don't know the name of these languages that existed. It was probably more than one that existed before the recognizable kind of blended language that we know is Greek came about. These languages were there; they were the languages indigenous to the, say, islands of the Eastern Mediterranean, and maybe related to some of the places in what is now today Turkey, some of the languages there as well. And also there are languages, as we know, yesterday I was talking about Basque Pelota. The Basque language is another one of these languages that was on the continent that we now call Europe long before the people who speak the languages that we now define as European languages were ever there. And so the words like syrinx, anything that ends in that, in English, when you see a word that ends in an NX, there's a good chance. I mean, obviously there are ones that aren't from this pre-Greek language of the Eastern Mediterranean, but all of the ones I'll talk about today are. So that's syrinx, which is how birds produce their voices, the larynx, which is sometimes called the voice box in humans, and that's another word that comes from these older languages before Greek existed, and the pharynx, which again, notice that has in English an NX. In Greek, it's actually has a gamma C. Just to let you know, because there's a double G sound in the g. There's a double G sound apparently in the old languages I'm talking about that existed before Greek existed, and that is a really good marker often of words that come from that language. It was used a lot in a lot of words, and a lot of words that are used today actually come from that language, the most mysterious language of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now back to the bird voice thing. So Where the syrinx is between, there are two tubes that go into the bird's lungs, and then there's the tube that goes up, the windpipe. It's at the juncture there of where they fork, and there's two separate kind of uh, sets of muscles that control the way that sound comes out and can shape the sound, and that's how birds produce their calls. They shape the sound with that uh, syrinx, and that is how they do it. Now, they can do a really complex range of sounds with that, but they can also use, so for example, in parrots can use their esophagus. That's the other pipe there. That's the pipe that use for food. That food goes down, right? And the parrots can use that to make sounds that we make with our lips. They're technically called plosives, but it's like B and P. Parrots don't have lips, so they can't make that sound the same way, but they constrict their esophagus, the thing the food goes down, in order to make that sound when they're trying to imitate human, where they are imitating human sounds, and they need to make a B or a P sound. So it's kind of a little bit like maybe ventriloquists can do. Really good ventriloquists are able to do that without using their lips. So that's kind of the same thing. It's kind of neat. That's a good point. That if you don't have lips, you have to figure out other ways to make those sounds that lips make, right? And that's why ventriloquists have to learn how to make those sounds without moving their lips, and end up doing it a little bit like what parrots do. Now, in the human situation, we have the larynx, which is something that only really can produce the humming noise. If you close your mouth and make your tongue stand still, that's what you sound like, right? Because you can only just kind of like force air through the area where your vocal cords are, which are the muscles that let that can shape the air that's coming out. Now, that in birds, because it's in a different place, and it has two different channels, so to speak, birds can produce two different tones at the same time and do a wide range of tones. That, by the way, that syrinx, that the ancient word is the word for a set of pipes, like a flute, like pipes, that kind of thing, like a musical instrument. The panpipes, they're sometimes called. That's what syrinx means. So in a sense, it kind of makes a lot of sense that you would call this part of the bird sound system the pipes. This is what they play, basically. Now, in the human version of all of this, the humming part comes through the larynx, and then our tongue and our lips make the sounds that we want. They're the ones that form that humming voice noise that's coming from the air going through our vocal cords, and they articulate, as it's called, the sound into words and other noises that make sense to us. Now, there's also a part of that system that I mentioned called the pharynx, and that's a kind of above the larynx. It's the part above both the esophagus, the feeding tube part, and the windpipe, the trachea. That is before, after the larynx and before the tongue and that part of the mouth. That's called the pharynx. It's usually we might use the word like the throat, or the upper part of your throat, the back of your throat. Well, maybe. Anyway, so that also comes from an ancient word describing all of these parts. There was confusion in ancient times because these are, as I said, these were all borrowed words from a language that had long disappeared. So there was some confusion between what the larynx was and what the pharynx was. And so the pharynx was also considered the thing where like food goes through, especially, which is true. But then it basically gets mixed up a little bit with the esophagus in ancient times in terms of like what words that are used, and sometimes they just got confused. Well, that just comes from a natural kind of not thinking the same way we do about anatomy. Now, the fact that there are two different words in the same language that existed before Greek existed in that area suggests to me that they probably were two different things. I'm guessing that actually the pharynx was probably thought of as being the esophagus, and the larynx was probably thought of as being the kind of windpipe, or at least the very top of the windpipe as it is. And I think that I have a feeling that that's why you'd have two different words. Usually you don't have two different words for the same thing in one language, just because that doesn't, it's not very helpful. Well, let's talk about what I think is the most musical bird in the world. And its name, its original name, comes from a language that is also no longer around, which is the ancient form of the Tupi language. And this is in the forests around the Amazon and related areas in the northern parts of South America. And that's where this bird exists. And in those languages, because Portuguese borrowed the word from those languages, in those languages, the bird is called a uirapuru. And in Portuguese, it's called a uirapuru because they borrowed the word from the Tupi language. And the uirapuru is a just really musical bird. It's a wren, is what we call it in English, a type of wren. We won't go into that. Okay, so let's listen to it. What do you think? Pretty cool, right? I think it sounds a little bit like experimental music from the maybe early and mid 20th century. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the 1930s, I believe, Heitor Villa-Lobos, a Brazilian composer, composed a piece called Uirapuru. And that is kind of like perfect. That's like exactly the time I was thinking about. I didn't think about that. I found that out after I thought the bird sounded like music from, well, the 1930s. So that's kind of interesting. All right, well, let's ask the cards for something interesting and see what they have to say today. So, yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards. Tell us some things. It's card 46. Always begin with specific and detailed action. To clean a dirty pot, I was just cleaning a dirty pot. Begin by scrubbing one dirty spot, and then solve all problems and tackle all jobs the same way. Start with a specific and concrete action on one small element, and think about how that's going to set you off to figure out how to do everything else in a systematic way. So think of an example where you started something with one small action that ended up being something really big. And I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.